In this lesson, we'll create cable passages in our component tray. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to use fillet, create a mirrored feature, and sketch a slot. The next thing that I want to do is I want to approach the openings needed to get cables into and out of this area. So we're going to hide the X-star body and we're going to look at this from the top. On the power distribution board, I need to make sure that I have an opening to bring the power cable into and out of. We're going to be using an XT60 connector, which is a standard connector type for this size of quadcopter and type of battery. And I want to make sure that I have enough room to take those cables into and out of this area. In order to do that, I'm going to create a sketch on this back face. And I'm going to go from this top edge and I'm going to create a simple slot. Now I'm going to start from the center point and I'm going to come down and I'm simply going to just create a wide slot. Now the reason I'm using the slot tool is because it allows me to select the center point at the top. You see the triangle midpoint relation, and then I can simply add a dimension here of 8 millimeters and a distance to its construction center line of 12 millimeters. And that will allow me to do an extrude cut going up to next geometry. For the distance, I'm going to change it to object and select the inside face and make sure that I'm only cutting body 60 and say OK. Now that is more than I needed to cut out, but what it does is it allows me to bring this cutout down to the top of the power distribution board, and that way I know that the cables can come out and not have a lot of wall or a lot of geometry that they have to hop over. I can also come back and I can add a fillet in these upper corners to reduce a little bit more material. Now if I show the X-star body, this opening allows us to see exactly where it falls. Now I do also need to be aware that I need cables to come into and out of these areas going to the motors. Now if we show the X-star body, from the bottom view and we look at the motors, the cables are going to be coming along this channel and we want them to come into the side of this body. So we're going to create an extrude cut on the side by creating a sketch, hiding the X-star body, and making sure that we can get the cables into and out of these areas. Now in order to do that, again I'm going to use the slot sketch, and I'm going to start by sketching along this edge and dragging it down. And again, using that center point allows me to directly snap onto this edge, and then I have a nice rounded cutout to use. I'm going to give this a 5 millimeter dimension. I'm going to give it a distance of 25. And I'm going to take that center point in 15 millimeters from this edge. I'm going to extrude cut the top and bottom, and I'm going to go all the way through. And I'm going to make sure that I'm only cutting body 60. Notice that it's also trying to cut through the ESC. I'm going to make sure that I'm not cutting through the ESC, and I'm going to say OK. I then am going to create a mirror of this. I want to pattern that feature, which is the extrude cut. I'm going to pattern it across the front plane. And we're going to use optimized, and we're going to say OK. Now you notice that it essentially cuts out the entire thing. Now in order to make that a little bit cleaner, I'm going to edit this sketch, and I'm going to make this a little bit longer so that it goes all the way past that midline. Instead of mirroring that feature, we could also just take that slot all the way across, but either one works fine. Now if you decide that you don't need that much of a cutout, you can do a much smaller cutout and mirror it across and have the same effect. Now if we show the X-star body, you can see that we have a small amount of area here where we can have the cables come into and out of. And what will happen is we will zip tie the cables inside of this channel, and then we'll wrap them into this recess here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a fillet to the top. I'm going to do that on both sides. And let's try a 3mm fillet. You can see that it goes all the way to this boss, so we're going to make it a bit smaller. And go ahead and make it 2mm and say OK. So that way we don't have any sharp edges for the cables to get hung up on. So now we've got a cable entry for the XT60 for the power from the battery. We've got cable entries for to and from the ESCs to the motors. And the last thing we need is a cable passage for the antenna for the remote. So the way I'm going to handle that is I'm going to come into this face, I'm going to create a sketch, and again I'm going to use the sketch slot, and I'm going to come from the top, and I'm going to come all the way down to the bottom, and I'm going to create a 4mm slot and say OK. I'm going to make sure that this snaps to the bottom, it snaps to the top, and I'm going to give it a distance from this edge. And notice that it's trying to over-constrain it because it's trying to add a height dimension. Sometimes if you have things pre-selected, it might give that error. What we want to do is we want to come in 4mm from that end, and we want to make sure that we snap to the top so that way we're fully defined. I'm going to do an extrude cut of this. I'm going to grab the top and bottom, and I'm going to bring this in, rotate it around. I'm going to bring it in slightly past the inside face. I'm going to go in 5mm. So that way I can come down to the bottom, make sure that we're cutting through just that single body. And I'm going to, again, fillet these edges, but I also want to fillet these bottom edges as well. And let's go ahead and add 2mm and say OK. So now once we have this thing in reality, we can have that antenna exit wherever we want. If it needs to come out the bottom, then we'll be able to do that as well. Let's go ahead and save the file, and then we can handle attaching the batteries to the bottom using zip ties or straps. But save our file so we don't lose any work, and then move on to the next step.